most recent is Soul in Seoul, African American popular music and K-pop. And I was lucky enough to do the index for this book. And I really loved it. I was blown away by the attention to detail. And so I really wanted to make sure that we were able to get Crystal in to talk about K-pop a little bit more. So I am going to hide and mute myself, and I will let Dr. Anderson have at it.
All righty, I'm going to get the techie stuff out of the way and bring up this PowerPoint presentation. And share screen, and we just did this, so this should work. All righty. Thank you so much, Lori and Brian, for having me. I am always excited to talk about K-pop, and today we're going to be talking about kind of the trajectory of K-pop. It's very interesting down in the fandom world. You know, there are many debates that are going on, and one of the more ever-present debates is, what are the generations or the eras of K-pop? Because now K-pop is almost 30 years old, a little bit over, depending on where you start. So now people feel like they can talk about how K-pop has changed over the course of time. But people don't agree because, that's just how fandoms are. And so one of the big debates is, what makes one era different from the next, and what's happening with K-pop now, and what's the future of K-pop. And so we'll take a stab at that in this presentation today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is K-pop. I always like to lay that groundwork and not assume that you are all aficionados about K-pop. And then we'll talk about K-pop generations. And then we'll talk about kind of the future of K-pop and the current K-pop generation that we're in. So what is K-pop? Not to be negative, but K-pop is not a genre. It's often referred to as a genre. And so I like to try to correct that wherever I go, because that actually diminishes K-pop. Is not a genre. It has genres. And so in order to talk about K-pop, we want to keep in mind that it has varieties of music underneath this kind of umbrella. And I wanted to define K-pop in a way that captured the various manifestations of K-pop, and also kind of find those things that nearly all of the groups and artists that we consider to be K-pop have in common. And so this is what I came up with. And for the most part, I think this covers a lot of what people, and by people, I mean both fans and critics and scholars, mean when they say K-pop. So nearly everyone agrees that K-pop refers to this shift in Korean popular music that happens in the 1990s. And so it doesn't mean that Korean popular music before the 1990s just disappeared. What happened is you had another kind of music emerge that was very distinct, and sometimes a conversation with, again, those people didn't go away. It was a new popular music that emerged. And so what was it about that music that made it different? One of the things that made that music different was its connection to hip hop. And a very interesting thing that happens is that both the kind of pop side of K-pop, which are the artists are often referred to as idols. These are the people who sing and dance. They're very beautiful people. The people who do K-dramas, and they'll appear on variety shows. They'll do endorsements, and they'll be in magazine shoots. So that's kind of the face of K-pop globally for a lot of people. But remember, K-pop is not a genre. It has genres. So in with them are artists who are in other genres. And my book, Soul and Soul, focuses on Korean hip hop and Korean R&B artists. But you have Korean rock groups also that kind of fall into this category, depending on how, whether they are connected with the other elements of this particular definition of K-pop. So clearly you can hear the hip hop in idol music, but then you have Korean hip hop. And a lot of times people like to really not associate one with the other. I think that's the polite way to put it. And the same thing happens in American hip hop. There's this there's a trend where people want to say that hip hop is distinct and it's separate and it's not like that pop trash. But in Korea, we have to remember that hip hop, American hip hop, is the source for both idol music and for Korean hip hop. Okay. It's so K-pop that emerged in the 1990s has a strong connection to hip hop and also dance and R&B music. And I can elaborate on that during the Q&A session. And was also associated with the youth. But that wasn't it. You had to have other characteristics in order to kind of fall into this category of K-pop. And for me, those other characteristics are global aspirations. So in the 1990s, when you get the emergence of K-pop, if you were a musical artist in an East Asian country, you were just going to be in your East Asian country. K-pop was of the mindset from the beginning. So this particular form of Korean popular music said, we're going to go outside of Korea. And initially that meant going to Japan and China, and then eventually it meant going to destinations in the West. The other thing about this particular kind of Korean popular music is that it's hybrid. It's combining elements of Korean and foreign music traditions. And I would argue the chief foreign music tradition is African-American music. Again, we can chat about that in the Q&A session. So as a result, my definition of K-pop is this really big umbrella that intentionally covers a lot of different groups, because one of the things that is not quite as known is that there's a lot of collaboration going on across genre lines in K-pop, because the overall scene is not that large. All right. So I want to give you an idea of what the genres, or at least 3 of them, sound like in K-pop. And the first is an idol group, EXO. I tell people all the time, if my book was just all the people that I liked, that would be a very different book. But when I give presentations, I get to choose my favorite people. So EXO is the quintessential idol group. Depending on where you catch them in the trajectory of their career, there are 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 members. And this is what a lot of people think of when they think of idol groups or Korean pop groups in K-pop. 이 거리 완전 난리야 사람들 사이는 남이야 함께하는 매 순간이 like boom 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 what up Hey girl 영원 같던 찰나 운명 같은 순간 나를 한순간 뚫고 가 넌 내 이름 불러주면 나에게로 다가와 놀라워 순간처럼 낮아 너를 마주하는 순간 oh my 편하게 여기 앉아 이제 내 얘기를 들어봐 I don't care 멀리 멀리 돌아간대도 이렇게 너의 곁에 단한 남자가 돼줄 테니 So this kind of music is made with the idea that it's going to be performed. So when they're putting together this music, they're definitely thinking of the choreography. But if you're familiar with American pop music of the 1990s and R&B of the 1990s, then you probably hear that New Jack Swing in there. It was a kind of music that you would hear on Janet Jackson records. And part of that is because of the person who is largely credited with New Jack Swing, and that is Teddy Riley. Teddy Riley actually worked on this track for EXO. So one of the things that we could talk about in the Q&A session is when we say that R&B is definitely at the root of K-pop, it's definitely at the root, both in terms of the music, but also in terms of the creative production. Alrighty, so idol groups, that's what you're going to see when people think about K-pop. But remember, my K-pop umbrella is really, really broad. And so falling under that category are also Korean R&B artists. And so I'm going to let you listen to one of those artists. The name of this artist is Wee Sung, or as the stage name is Real Slim.
Yo, yo, you don't know me yet. Real slow. You know you're gonna find me. Hit you in my slamming beat. Fat lyrics. I bet you never seen this before. Now, listen up.
Can't you feel my breeze so real and slow? I will always bring you on low. If you're ready for this, put your body to the floor.
So We Sung is drawing on this really in-depth, very developed male R&B tradition that includes people ranging from Al Green to Sam Cooke to Teddy Pendergrass to Brian McKnight, which a lot of K-pop artists cite as an influence, and Keith Sweat. That kind of vocal tradition that We Sung draws on, and throughout his career kind of straddles the line between that R&B tradition, that male R&B tradition, and the hip hop tradition. But for the most part, as you can see, that's an R&B vocal, and that's what he draws on the most. It's also important to note that with Korean R&B, that's what she is the idols. Almost all the time, you're never going to see them in the video. Like there's going to be some kind of narrative going on. They're going to be singing in the background because for them, the most important thing is the vocals, which you cannot fake. And one of the things that people may not realize about Korean popular music or Korean popular music culture is that they still have a radio culture. So if you're promoting your song, more than likely you're going to go on somebody's radio show and they're going to ask you to sing it live. So it's really not in your best interest if you're purporting to be an R&B singer not to be able to sing. All righty, let's go to hip hop. And this is Korean hip hop proper. And Epic High, who just had a show in Washington, D.C., is a veteran Korean hip hop group. And so let's get a sense of what they sound like.
Let's go. Tick tock in this time. When I set it off, can nobody stop it in time? Get off the block, son, and get your sunblock when I rhyme. It's eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. From the top, rewind. Wrote rhymes in my dad's attic. Rap addicts are somatic, and I'm still fanatic. Never stop, but when I'm stopped, I jog my mind around the writer's block till it's out of breath and asthmatic. I've had it with the paper chase. Need I mention the rap game is all show and lyrical dissension? Pretension, obsession for physical possession. I'll pay for your CD, but pay no attention. Ascension, I'll never lie to get it. Fake people piss me off like diuretic to die or live it. You know the choice is yours. Just make sure that the voice is yours.
Penny, yeah, he's breaking it down. NYK.
So while Korean hip hop groups draw from American hip hop like their idol counterparts, what they do with it is radically different. So a group like Epic High reflects the kind of eclecticism we find in American hip hop groups like The Roots, that use of live instrumentation, as well as drawing from various genres, like a group called A Tribe Called Quest. Okay, so that's a pretty good overview of the landscape of K-pop. So in my book, I argue that K-pop engages in citational practices. What are citational practices? Well, citational practices are intentional and they are deliberate. They're musical references and performative elements that draw attention to the original material, as well as showing how those artists take that material and remix it or revamp it or transform it into something else. So I love this quote by Brittany Cooper because it does a really great job of explaining what the difference is between a citational practice and cultural appropriation, which is often hurled at K-pop for a variety of things that some people observe. There's one thing that we want to keep in mind when we're talking about either cultural appropriation or citational practices, and that is what some popular music scholars call listener competence. How you apprehend a piece of music depends largely on the repository of knowledge you're bringing to that piece of music. So the citational practice model suggests that the music is designed to point you back to the original. It's not a conspiracy. They're not trying to hide it. But you can only know that they're pointing back to another source if you know what that other source is. And so for me, cultural appropriation has become an overused term when people are talking about K-pop. Is just thrown around with very little care, so that when there are actually instances of someone taking something from one culture and using it in a way that mocks or demeans the original culture, that gets kind of washed over from kind of because so much focus gets placed on other things that may not rise to the level of cultural appropriation. So the idea of citational practices is an educational one, right? You're the use of samples or interpolations or lyrics or just music moods that suggest other artists is really there to link music traditions and not to erase. All right. So in K-pop, citational practices are those that draw on musical or performative elements, largely of African-American popular music culture. Is it the only foreign music popular culture that K-pop draws on? No, but I argue that African-American popular music is the largest. It's the well that people continuously go through. You can find it in so many eras of K-pop, which we'll talk about in a second, and so many different artists. They also do that. These artists also do this with an authenticity. So it is, I argue, consistent and consistent with the musical culture from which these elements originate. So much so that you can argue that K-pop functions as a branch of a global R&B tradition. Again, we can talk about that in the Q&A. So I want you to listen to how this might actually work in an instance. So let's start with MFSB, which is basically the house band for Philadelphia International Record Company out of Philly. And out of that record label comes the Philly sound, pioneered by Leon Huff and Kenny Gamble. And it's characterized by these lush strings, prominent guitar, this groovy rhythm, distinctive harmonies and horns. So let's just get a sense of what that sounds like. So some of you may know that it's the theme song to Soul Train. All right, now we got some common ground to work with. As I said, MFSB is the house band for Philly International Records. And so one of the artists that they work with is Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. So let's see how that sounds. Okay, so you can hear all of those hallmarks of the Philly sound because of MFSB backing up Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. So let's see what Dynamic Duo, who's a Korean hip hop group, does with this.
Yeah. What? Bring it back, bring it back, bring it back now. 돌아와, 돌아와, 돌아와 now. Bring it back, bring it back, bring it back now. 돌아와, 돌아와.
너무 익숙한 너와 난 두근거림이 부족해 오래된 습관처럼 서로 구속해 때때로 혼자였던 때가 그립기도 해 나는 사랑에 지쳐서 휴식이 필요해 서로 잘못의 길을 갈고 맑고 둘이를 잡고 불평하니까 화를 내니까 거의 매일 치고받고 바뀜에 찢어지자고 말했었는데 벌써.
So you may remember when I said that my definition of K-pop included the fact that K-pop is a hybrid musical form that takes elements from foreign music traditions and mixes them with Korean elements. And one of the biggest representatives of culture is language. So the first thing the Dynamic Duo does is they create a song, they rap these lyrics over, shall we call it an interpolation or a straight up sing? Over the organ and guitar, and then they add a beat, but they rap in Korean. And so this is what we mean by the hybridity of K-pop. But that's a hip hop group. Dynamic Duo is another veteran straight up Korean hip hop group doing what hip hop artists do. They sample, they change tempos and introduce beats and do different things with vocals. But let's see what a Korean R&B group does by looking at this song by Brown Eyed Soul. The name of the song is Philly Love Song. It's clearly an interpolation of the Harold and the Blue Notes, The Love That I Lost. So this is what we mean by citational practices. And this is a really obvious example. But in order for you to make these connections, you'd have to have listener competence that included knowledge of the Philly sound or Harold and the Blue Notes or MFSB or any of these things. So this is what I think is a much richer approach to take when talking about what the relationship is with K-pop and other music traditions and what K-pop is doing in terms of its sound, as opposed to something like cultural appropriation. All righty, so we've really laid the groundwork. We know what K-pop is. We know how diverse it might be in terms of sound. It has genres. It's a hybrid music form and engages in citational practices. So we're now in a really great position to talk about how K-pop has developed over time in terms of generations. And I really wish that this was neat, that I could tell you on this day at this time, K-pop goes from first gen to second gen, but it really isn't that neat. And our historian friends already know how messy this can be. But almost everybody who talks about generations in K-pop all agree that first gen K-pop goes from 1990 to 2002. Like, that's a hard stop. And why is it a hard stop? Well, it depends. You have to take a look at the groups that were out at the time. Now, once again, even though idol groups are the most visual and in front of the movement, so to speak, of K-pop, these people existed and were popular and released music at the same time. Like, they know who each other is. They listen likely to their music, especially if you were an idol. You had to know your stuff and you have to know other people's stuff. So in this picture, we have some of the first generation idols in terms of the groups, SES, Shinhwa, and HOT, largely credited with being the first successful K-pop boy idol group. They really loved that bowl bob cut because everybody had it for first gen. But we also want to make sure that we keep that varied landscape in place, that you also had girl groups in the form of SES, and you had BoA, who has, again, largely been credited with saving SM Entertainment due to her popularity in Japan, which was the first kind of extension out of Korea that K-pop made. She's the queen of K-pop, and I think she was like 16 when she did it. At the same time, we have OG veteran hip hop artist Tiger JK, as well as Fly to the Sky, which is a Korean R&B group. They started out as an idol group. So if you want to actually see the transformation, how one goes from being an idol group to a Korean R&B group, the trajectory of Fly to the Sky's career is really, really instructive for that reason. Down here we have Jarim, which is a rock band, and they're still together. And then Rain. Again, it's not pretty, but this is pretty definite. Like, if you walked up to an average K-pop fan on the street and you asked them who's first gen, nearly everybody would be able to agree on who's first gen. But what did first gen sound like? Remember, K-pop, even in its inception, drew heavily on African-American genres, R&B, and hip hop, and the first generation idol group, GOD, which stands for Groove Overdose, I think reflects this. So let's take a listen to Report to the Dance.
Yo, 여기는 GOD. Report to the dance floor. I repeat, everybody report to the dance floor. Dance if you want to get next to. Groove if you want to get near to. Scream if you really know how to. Get down with G.O.D. Dance if you want to get next to. Groove if you want to get near to. Scream if you really know how to. Get down with G.O.D.
여기 모인 이유가 뭐야? 오늘 모두 한번 해보 good time 해보자는 얘기 아니야. 우리 쳐다보고 있는 너희들의 눈빛이 몰아나고 있는 시다.
So the thing about a group like GOD is that they drew heavily on R&B vocals, rap, but also funk music. And this is true from the first GOD album to the last GOD album, or the latest GOD album. And so what you hear is that trademark utilizing or drawing from multiple musical traditions, putting a Korean spin on that, which to me is the hallmark of K-pop, no matter what the genre is. Okay, so let's move on to second gen, because I know your question is, what happened to first gen? A lot of those groups from first gen got disbanded. HOT, but it's important to state that the way HOT, quintessential idol band that they were, or idol group that they were, sounds very different than when HOT puts out their last album, Outside Castle. So even though they had very short careers, some of these idol groups especially, you did see the development of their particular style. Now, did all groups or all artists cease to do things? No. Rain, we know, has a career now. God did a reunion album a couple of years ago. And so you don't have just a complete cessation of first gen groups, but the fact that they were there definitely colors the kind of sound that they have going forward. Now we get these upstarts, second generation, often called the golden era of K-pop, 2003 to 2011. Again, most people agree that this is what second gen is. It kind of starts with a group like TVXQ, which really developed that Japanese fan base, so much so that they're called by a completely different name in Japan. And so if you're a new K-pop fan and you're like, oh, I like TVXQ, or they're also called Tohoshinki in Japan, it's the same group. You also get the proliferation and differentiation of girl groups. So you had SES and Finkel and Baby Vox in the first generation, but all of those groups were rapidly disbanded. But in the second generation, not only do you get girl groups, but you get very different kinds of girl groups. And so on one hand, you have Girls' Generation or SNSD, and on the other hand, you have a group like 21, which you may be familiar with because I think their song was used for some kind of Apple promotion over here in the United States. And both of these are different from a girl group like the Wonder Girls. You continue to get the development of Korean hip hop. Here's Epic High, and then you get different kinds of male idol groups. So on one hand, a little bit more edgy group like Big Bang versus a very pop friendly group like Super Junior. So let's take a listen to what second gen sounds like, and because I get to choose my favorites, we are playing a track by the second gen group Shani called 1 Minute Back.
아니야 저 미소는 분명 네가 아냐 너무나 행복해 보이잖아 맞아 그냥 날 닮은 사람인 게 맞아 거기는 내 품이 아니잖아 발길을 뒤로 네가 날 보기 전에 뒤돌아 나가면 돼 Talk to you 널 되돌려 눈이 마주치면 돼 네 눈이 마주친다 왜 이럴까 1분만 더 시간을 뒤로 돌려 내게로 나가 1분만 더 시간을 뒤로 돌려 그냥 맛본 채로 가면 돼 제일 좋은 내일 보면 돼 1분만 더 시간을 가나 1분만 더
So one of the things that you're seeing with second gen is a proliferation of like everything, a proliferation of music styles, proliferation of different kinds of groups and artists, a proliferation of different kinds of genres and different kinds of vocal styles, different kinds of performances. It's always great to look at the choreography from second generation groups. So you also get the extension even further out from East Asia in terms of global aspiration. And so it's in this period of time where you start to see things like K-Cons in the United States and in places like France, and just a greater global spread. Now, K-pop still is a subgenre, or not a subgenre, a subculture when it does do this global spread. But I always encourage people not to poo-poo the subculture, because there are lots of subcultures that have a tremendous amount of influence in the mainstream culture. Okay, so once again, people generally agree that second gen ends at 2011, and then we get third generation in 2012. Why is this? And I'm going to try to explain it, even though as a K-pop fan, I just know you can hear the shift in the kinds of groups, particularly idol groups, that we started to get. And so 2012 is the year that EXO debuted. 2013 is the year that BTS debuts. So if you're looking at the landscape of K-pop, there's a discernible shift in the kinds of groups that debut, the kind of music that they put out. There's a continued global spread of K-pop during this time. But you also start to, but you still get that kind of quintessential Korean production and promotion strategies that are used in K-pop. And so I want to play you just a little bit of the group 17. Now, 17's thing, their personality, their identity is that originally there were 17 members in the group, and then that did not hold. And so the way that they now explain 17 is that there are 13 members in the group, there are 3 sub-teams, there's one group. My math isn't all that great, but I think that adds up to 17. And so they have a performance unit, they have a hip hop unit, they have a vocal unit, which gives them a lot of flexibility. And right now there are 13 people in this group. So let's just take a listen to what that sounds like. I can tell you that as we get further and further closer to where we are now in the history of K-pop, you get the proliferation of hip hop in different kinds of ways and different kinds of hip hop in K-pop.
무대만 서도 시선을 끌었지 반응에 온몸은 다운펌블게 성실히 몸에 뱉어 굳건히 세우는 탑 무너질 틈도 없이 가득 메꿨지 난 걱정이 작용해 절대 안해 부정 주위에서 그래 쟤처럼 되고 싶어 말해주고 싶었어 책을 읽어 그럼 나처럼 주위에서 엄지를 지켜 Oh yeah put your hands up 두 팔 두 다리 모두 올려 Oh yeah what the funk yeah 모두 자연스레 내게 모여 Hey 다들 날 보건 미니 heart and the love 딱 세워 다들 위를 향해 여기 앞에 있는 모두가 다 쳐다볼게 맘을 두드려 열부서 넌 날 위한 손님 knock 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 yeah. 지금 믿고 너와 함께 춤을 추듯이 요동치는 순간에 모두 내게서 come down 내게 들어라 훔쳐 타락가 boy
So one of the things that we know that happens, particularly with third gen, is this kind of, we have one team, how many configurations can we get out of it? And so 17 is a really great example of that. One of the ways that previous generations tried to pursue that is with legitimate sub units. And you see this in third and coming up on fourth gen as well, is how many ways can we put this group together to produce something that's new and different. The other thing that I want to point out with all 3 generations of K-pop that producers have noted when they go to Korea to work with Korean artists is the sheer number of changes that happen in any particular song, whether that's tempo, whether that's style, whether that's the tone of the music. Again, to me, that's the Korean part of Korean popular culture in terms of the hybridity. They are not afraid of going and mixing genres in a way that I think other music traditions don't do quite as frequently. Some people say that when you listen to some K-pop songs, it sounds like there are 3 songs in one. All right. So now let's talk about the future of K-pop and the challenge of the 4th gen group. So I want to show you why this is a challenge. So One Us and One We are brother groups. They're on the same label. There's a set of twins, and one twin is in One Us and one twin is in One We, but they sound radically different. So One Us is the idol group, One We is the band. So let's listen to what One Us sounds like.
가자. 오늘 달이 좋구나. 가자. 풍악을 우려 비리를 부어 저 달도 좋은 밤별빛이 다가와 우레줄 가득 비춰 정해진 건 없어 발길이 닿는 대로 마냥 걸어가 달이 좋구나.
우지 나는 우아 그 소리를 부르지만 고아 나비처럼 나는 벌처럼 쏴 악당을 쓸어 담고 저 작거리에 나를 모르는 사람이 없으니 기분이 좋구나. 동해 번쩍 서해 번쩍 우리 위한 축제가 벌어지는구나.
So you can see how hip hop is really at the front of One Us, but you can also hear that traditional Korean instrumentation going on in the back. Now, I want to play them both because I think this really illustrates what's going on with 4th Gen right now. So One We is the rock band, they're brother groups on the same label.
All I wanna is 멋진 내 맘대로 골라 끼게 머리 어깨 무릎 다 힙해.
Do it let me do it 나를 따라해 Kick it clapping 모두 같이 hip hip hip.
네가 뭘 하든 간에 Respect you 네가 뭘 하든 간에 늘 따끈따끈해 그 관심이 따끈따끈해 더 힐끔 맨날 부럽다 blind 넌 정말 lie Yo la blah 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 We will kind All I wanna be is 멋진 내 맘대로 골라 머리 어깨 무릎 다 너만이 돼 my passion.
So this song is actually a cover of an idol group, a girl group, which is also a sister group because they're all on the same label, Mamamoo. So One We and One Us will also collaborate with each other. So I'm going to use the technical term. 4th Gen is a wee bit of a hot mess because there's really nothing connecting them musically in a way that you saw with previous generations. People argue about when 4th Gen starts. There's not this really clear delineation between where 3rd Gen is, where 4th Gen starts. People are like, we're on 5th Gen now. There are sub-generations between among this or eras within it. So there's very little consensus about what's musically happening in order to describe 4th Gen as an era. So that's the challenge of 4th Gen. But what does that have to do, or what does that say about the potential future of K-pop? Now, I'm going to tell you to take this with a grain of salt because there's absolutely no way in the world that anybody could have predicted when SM Entertainment debuted HOT with those bob cuts that we were going to get what happened 30 years later. But there are reasons why I think that some of these things that I'm about to talk about are correct. So the first is that there's a sense in the fandom that there are too many K-pop artists. Now, there have been tons of K-pop artists in the past. The difference is that in 1st Gen, 2nd Gen, and 3rd Gen, for the most part, you did not have as much access to the behind the scenes of the K-pop industry that we get now. So now you get to see the development of groups when they're pre-debut. You get all of this footage about, how they're putting these groups together. There are shows, competition shows that create these groups. And again, you had these in previous generations. You just did not have so many of them or so much access to all of this K-pop industry stuff. And there are a lot of groups. And so the ecosystem cannot sustain all of these groups, or so many of these groups, or fewer of these groups at the kinds of levels we've seen with previous generations. So for instance, there was a girl group, Momoland, they just disbanded. So we're seeing fourth gen groups with shorter careers than their predecessors and more of them. So the ecosystem, many people are suggesting that the K-pop ecosystem is due for a contraction. At the same time, now, I'm going to try to say this as nicely as I can. The fandom seems to think that fourth gen groups are less talented than their predecessors, but I don't think that's the case. I think they have less time to be trained than their predecessors. And once again, this goes back to the increased visibility of what goes on behind the scenes. There's not enough time to develop that personality or identity of the group, make that connection with the fans, as we've seen with previous generations of groups. One of the things that I do think that will have an impact on the future of K-pop is an increased focus on the United States as a market. K-pop does not need the United States economically. It's got Japan and it's got China. And so the United States, being the hegemonic power that it is, represents prestige. And it's a market, but it's got to be the hardest market on the planet, especially if you are coming from East Asia. So what we're seeing in K-pop now is a more concerted effort to enter into this market. We've got more K-pop groups touring the United States than we've ever had. But anyone who knows the history of American music and American pop music in particular would be wary of, one, the trajectory that a group or artist would have to take and what they would have to give up in order to enter into the American mainstream, and then in order to stay in the American mainstream. So a lot of fans are really cautious about the desire of Korean agencies to make the United States a market in the way that both Korea and Japan function as a market. It's also important to note that at this point, if you are a K-pop artist, the music is the thing you make the least amount of money on. It's the thing that makes all the other things possible, which is why there's been such effort and care to make that music as quality as it can be, especially in the previous generations. But there are some people who are arguing that with fourth gen particularly, there's a greater focus on expectations from social media like TikTok, rather than that traditional training model that resulted in the kind of longevity we saw in previous generations. So in terms of what is the future of K-pop, I think that it's due for a contraction. When and how that happens, I'm not even sure. But I do think some of the things that we're seeing in terms of the agencies, this kind of desire to scoop up smaller agencies to increase kind of market share and to target the United States by just having more groups, having more artists, have them over here more, without addressing the big elephant in the room, which is language, and the United States' really dismal history with foreign language content of any kind. Makes it questionable whether that's the direction that K-pop should go in. I've always said that K-pop does better as a subculture. And I know it's not as prestigious as being in an American mainstream, but a subculture gives you longevity that you may not find in the American mainstream. And we can talk about all kinds of genres. You know, for the longest time, hip hop was a subculture in the United States, and some people would argue that it was better when it was that way. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, we do actually have a question in the Q&A from Julian Chow, who says, "Thank you for your talk today. I find it fascinating how you have made K-pop a research interest and developed in a new way that explores it in a way that it has not been explored before. My question for you is, American pop slash hip hop slash R&B are all very individualistic and artist oriented. But in K-pop, we see the opposite, where corporate firms dominate and organize. From your perspective and research, how does this corporate organization influence the hybridity and mixture of Korean and foreign music styles?
So that is a really great question. And let's take it back to the United States for a second, particularly when we look at the history of American pop music. We know what the discourse or the narrative is of American pop music, right? Groups and artists scrounging around on their own, and then they become popular and they're really known for their individualism. We link that to authenticity, except that pop music is a commercial venture wherever it is around the globe. I mean, no one's making a record and sticking it in their closet. And so when we look at record labels in the United States, when we look at entities like the Brill Building or Motown, when we think about labels like Capitol Records, I mean, Prince changed his name to a symbol and wrote it on the side of his face for like a year. So I know what the myth is, right, of the creative artist in pop music, but I'm not so sure if that's the reality, especially for commercial popular music. So when we take a look at what's going on in Korea, there are a lot of parallels. And in the book, I talk about the parallels between the Korean entertainment agencies and a thing like Motown. So just because you have a commercial entity doesn't mean they don't care about anything else. And one of the things that I argue is that, yes, they're companies, they want to make money, but they also have something else that they want to do. And some people would argue sometimes the desire for profit overrides the other things that they want to do. But they do want to do other things. So Berry Gordy with Motown Records, yes, he wanted to make money. He was an unabashed capitalist. The man is still alive. But he was also very interested in the perception of African Americans in the 1950s and 1960s. And so even though Motown was a commercial venture, it would not have worked had he not paid attention to the quality of the music that they were making. Berry Gordy spent a lot of time on artist development, which he stole, borrowed, drew from Hollywood, because that public perception was that important for Black people in a segregated United States culture. And I would argue that the same thing is in play with Korean agencies, particularly an agency like SM Entertainment, who likes to produce what they perceive as, Korea's artists, right? They have a particular kind of public persona. It's the reason why you hear about that carefully curated public persona from artists like SM Entertainment, as opposed to Party Central YG Entertainment, where anything and everything seems to go. And so I think that it's complicated because you can have both of those things happening at the same time. I think that what we're about to see is going to be very interesting, especially with an agency like SM Entertainment. Recent drama, I'm like, that's a K-drama right now. The recent drama with the attempted takeover of Hybe Entertainment, but also more importantly, Chris Lee's SM 3.0 plan, which calls for more artists to be debuted. I think he said 8 in a year. And this almost kind of continuous production, promotion, touring kind of model they have, or that he wants to set up, I think a lot of people are afraid that it's going to have a really negative effect on the quality of the music that SM puts out. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you very much. We have a raised hand, and so I have enabled you to speak. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My question is, I have two. Could the idea of fourth generation groups not having talent could be the fact that second generation and third generation groups have normalized talent, like producing music, being great at dancing, things like that? And then my second question is the fact that due to there being a massive online presence of third and fourth generation groups, new fans see this as there are too many groups. And these third and fourth generation groups have not hit like the 5 or 7 year curse, or like they're not one of like the 5 to 10% of groups that actually make it in like a long term. Sorry, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So I'm going to take your second question first. It's actually not just new fans that are saying there are too many groups. There are people who became K-pop fans, and this is also very fascinating, that how long your fan age, or how long you've been a fan, not how old you are, how long you've been a fan has a really interesting impact on the way you perceive the fandom. So once again, they were like, if you go back and you look at the groups that debuted in like second gen and with third gen, you weren't really if you were a fan during second gen, that didn't bother you because you didn't see this, their pre-debut, their pre-debut, you didn't see all of that. So you aren't even really paying attention to those. But now we have a tremendous amount of behind the scenes footage. We've got TikTok, we got YouTube, we got Instagram. It's just a lot. And so it's the number of groups, but it's also the exposure of the number of groups. And also, if you're a new fan and you become a fan now and you're hit with that avalanche of content, that's a very different experience than somebody who became a fan during second or third gen. The second question about second gen normalizing talent. I'm going to think about that because second and third gen do have a reputation for talent. But I also think that what second gen in particular did was expand what talent was. So SHINee is a very different group than, say, Infinite or than, say, Super Junior, compared to TVXQ, compared to Big Bang. One of the jokes in the fandom, if you're a Super Junior fan, is that they put Ye-sung in the back because everybody knows he can't dance. Now he has gotten better. Yay for Ye-sung. But they weren't perfect. I think they utilized the strengths of the people in the groups. That's one of the critiques, I think, of K-pop, that it's manufactured and these groups are perfect. You ask a fan, they will tell you every imperfection of the groups that they like. It's not that they're perfect. But what they did is they leveraged the strengths of the people who were in the groups. So that even if you had, quote unquote, less talented people in the group, you utilize them in a way that made their talent shine. So whereas Jason can't dance to save his life until recently, the man has a voice that puts a lot of other of the members in Super Junior to shame. So I think it's the strategic deployment. I also think that a lot of fourth gen groups are, as I like to say, not done. They're like gooey in the middle. And a great example of this is that EXO was not done. They were gooey in the middle, but they the promotional strategy for EXO. First of all, there were 23 teaser trailers for EXO before they came out. Then they hit you with these pre-debut, or we don't even know what they were called, but they were these super highly produced tracks. And then you got EXO. So you were okay with them not being done. They were okay not being gooey in the middle, but you saw that goo firm up over time. And I think because so many of the fourth gen groups are targeting social media like TikTok, which is like, you know, attention span of a net kind of thing. You don't have time to look and see of whether somebody's gooey or not. It's setting up a completely different standard. And if you're older, fan age, older K-pop fan, then you are less interested in that.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A, so I'd like to get to those. We are running a little short on time. I apologize for that. But or actually, I don't know what time we're supposed to finish. I was assuming 4, it might be 5. I mean, 4:30. Regardless, sorry. Let me get to this question. This is from Emma Hoopengardner, who says, I'm more of a 3rd gen fan myself, with EXO being my favorite group. And I notice that there's a downward trend of interactions between groups as the generations progress. Lots of people on social media argue that 3rd and 2nd gen collaborating and creating a sense of community was a huge part of the culture. Do you notice an absence of this during the 4th generation?
We do. We see we can point to instances where this was the case. So if you go back and look at something like Mama from the 2nd gen era, one of the things you looked forward to were those like crazy collaboration stages that went across agencies. And because there were the big 3 during that time, I think a lot of people don't remember or don't realize that they would trade trainees. So you knew people in other agencies, and whether you formally collaborated with them or not, you just knew them. And there were fewer of them, right? There were fewer of them. I think that with 4th gen, again, if the target is just, we want to start this dance craze on TikTok, you're not seeing that kind of interaction. Some groups you are. So some groups you're seeing that we know that you're friends with this person, or you've got people who are related, which also helps the kind of camaraderie to form. But some people are arguing, if there's this, desire to enter into the American mainstream, the mainstream of American popular culture definitely valorizes that individualism over the group. Is one of the reasons why the really big groups have a really hard time in the United States, because we don't have a tradition where you have 9 people in a group or you have 13 people in a group. We don't have that. But if you're familiar with, say, Japanese popular culture, you're completely down with that. That because you have experience with it. So yes, I think that you do see more collaboration, and one of the reasons maybe why you're not seeing more collaboration might be the entrance of an idea like competition, especially when you enter into a market like the United States.
Thank you. We had another question. What are your thoughts about the allegations in the media of harsh training regimes for K-pop trainees?
So is this the dark side of K-pop stories? There have always been dark side of K-pop stories. So let me just say this up front. Every music industry has its experience with exploitation of the artists that are in it. My issue with the way that the media portrays the Korean music industry and these dark side of K-pop stories about trainees is that they make it seem like it's so much worse than what's going on in the West. And part of that is a little bit of, Orientalism going on. So we need to be really savvy and really media literate when it comes to those kinds of things. But I also posit this, people talk about how the trainees are trained. And I wonder how we compare that with something like the way that Olympic gymnasts are trained. They start at a ridiculously early age. They train really, really super hard for a spot on a team where the odds are against you of whether you're going to make it or not, or the way that ballerinas are trained, or the way that other athletes are trained. Again, I want us to be really media savvy when we see those stories and see how they're deployed in terms of shaping our perception of Korean culture.
Thank you. We have another question, and this is from Ariel Bernal. K-pop has traditionally been composed of people only of Korean ethnic descent and other East Asian backgrounds like Japanese or Chinese. Fatu Samba of Black Swan is from Africa, and Lana, who is Tatar, Eastern Russian, have recently come into the K-pop scene. Do you think that K-pop groups or idols with non-East Asian members will become popular? Or do you think that being of East Asian descent is an unspoken requirement to be a popular K-pop idol?
So this is a really interesting question too. And I'm glad that you put some historical context around this. So I think prior to fourth gen, because we're going to bring up the complications that fourth gen bring to this in a minute, just because of when fourth gen emerges in terms of the geopolitical environment that's happening. So prior, one of the biggest, I think, complaints that K-pop fans, and these are global K-pop fans, can't really speak to Korean fans. We need some Korean researchers to get with our Korean fandoms over there. But for global fans, the issue was, the issue a lot of time was, are you going to be in this K-pop group in the way that the Korean people are? So yes, we have Chinese Canadians and we have Asian Americans in K-pop, but we've also noticed that even some Asian Americans don't fare well in K-pop because they don't acknowledge the difference of that Korean culture. So I'm going to use Jay Park because he's just sitting right there. So Jay Park from Seattle, Asian American, was in the group 2PM and very publicly and visibly, depending on who you talk to, either left of his own accord or was kicked out the group because he said that a lot of negative things about Korean culture. I'm like, dude, you're in a K-pop group. But it was an idol group. So Jay Park goes off and becomes a solo artist on his own, and he's hip-hop. Except, is he really hip-hop? I know Jay Park has a dual personality. Sometimes he's R&B, the guy you can bring home to your mom. And then sometimes he's trying to be hardcore hip-hop in all the bad ways, right? That we know that we critique hip-hop for its misogyny, and its materialism and things like that. But people were disappointed. I think some people were disappointed in Jay Park because he either brought or he just developed he didn't attempt to engage with Korean culture. And I think that's what people are looking for. So for instance, you might be familiar with the American K-pop group. What is the name of that group? So somebody put together an American K-pop group that ended up being like a bunch of white guys, and then they went to Korea to promote as a K-pop group. And I'm like, do you know the language? Like, it just really came off really like not sincere. So I think what people are looking for in terms of whether we're ever going to get that kind of representation in K-pop is that are we going to get somebody who's actually going to be a K-pop trainee in that kind of way? In the idol sense, what I find really fascinating is that we don't ask this of Korean hip-hop artists, or we don't ask this of our Korean R&B artists, but we want the pop artists to carry this and do this work. I'm like, is it really for them to carry? And then you can turn that around. It's like, what music tradition or what music group is really the model for that right now? Because I think you saw a little bit more of that actually in the 60s and 70s compared to how our music industries are set up, particularly in the United States, because the whole reason why we have these hard barriers between genres is because that's a promotional thing. That's not really a aesthetic musical thing. We have hip hop and rock and country to sell records, not necessarily to be emblematic of the kind of music that they represent. And so we're still waiting. But I think that has a huge role to play in when and whether we're going to get non-East Asian representation in K-pop idol groups.